Hello. In this presentation, we're going to start this process of identifying actual arguments based on things that people have written sort of in the real world, right, in actual literature or whatnot. Very often in just a regular logic textbook, the arguments are very clear, they're very straightforward, you've got the standard premises leading to a conclusion, and that's great, but that's not usually the way that we actually experience arguments as presented in the real world. So here we might have the kind of argument that we might actually see. We might actually read something like this, and we've got to sort of tease out what's the actual argument here. By the way, this is from Rene Descartes. This is one of the more famous works in philosophy. Notice his actual conclusion that he's aiming at here. This is his I think, therefore I am argument. And actually the argument itself is much bigger. It occupies, many chapters in this work of his, Meditations on First Philosophy. But this is part of the core. This is kind of the ending point that gets to that famous conclusion. And there's all kinds of things going on here, but if you're going to try to assess whether his argument is actually deductively valid, or maybe whether it's just a strong argument, inductively strong or cogent, you need to tease out like, what exactly are the precise premises and this precise conclusion that he's aiming at here. And then we can do the work of evaluating how good the argument actually is. So when people are writing, like I said, they very rarely just present, the dry, bare bones premises and then conclusion and make it all straightforward, because that's not interesting writing. That's not what literature is. Even if it's just an essay, like a philosophy essay or a science essay, it's not as interesting for the reader just to read sort of just bare bones, dry premises like that. So authors will incorporate all kinds of other rhetorical elements, like maybe just some extra turns of phrase that are very creative and maybe a little more entertaining and interesting. And they do that just to make it funner to read. Or they might be including some of those things perhaps to distract the reader from a part of their argument that actually is not very strong. Or they might be including some psychological techniques for trying to get their audience to be more likely to accept their conclusion, regardless of whether their argument itself is actually really strong or really weak or valid or invalid or whatnot. A lot of what authors throw in there is just to try to create a mood for the reader so that they'd be more likely to be on the author's side. But those aren't sort of the core elements of the argument. We need to strip those away and zero in. If our job is to assess the argument itself, then we need to strip away all those extra things. So I've got a couple other examples we can just look at just so that we know what we're talking about here. So this is an opinion piece that showed up in the Wall Street Journal not too long ago, May 15th, 2020. And so, it's an argument against the current education secretary. I'm sorry. This one, the next one is about the education secretary. This one is about the Equal Rights Amendment, which is a proposed amendment to the Constitution. And, it's got all this sort of loaded language in here. I'm not going to read it all out. You can read it yourself if you'd like. These various claims and so on, they sound really dramatic. And so the reader is more likely, the thought is, to be on the side of this author when they start talking about, endangering all women with their potential to eliminate sort of women's only prisons or battered women's shelters. It's like those all sound bad. And so we have an emotional reaction there. And those might not actually be part of the argument itself. Here's another one. This is the one about the education secretary. And clearly emotional things, the most toxic thing ever to happen to public education, those kinds of things, and then a variety of other claims that may or may not be part of the core argument itself. what is this person really trying to say? Like, what are the specific premises? What are the specific conclusion? How well do those premises actually support that conclusion? We need to get rid of all these extra rhetorical flourishes and zero in on just the argument itself. So, and these are sort of officially published things. More common that we run into nowadays are sort of so-called arguments, or things that are sort of like arguments that are thrown around on social media. So you might see something like this. Just a bunch of terrible things that the person says, and then applies them or associates them sort of with a particular political candidate at the time, and then just sort of an emotional outburst at the end, and then it's up to us to take this mess and try to figure out, is there a real argument here? And if so, what is it? What is this argument, and how good of an argument is it really? Now, this presentation isn't going to go through, it's not exhaustive techniques for doing this, just sort of the first steps towards making this happen. As was presented in a previous one of these, an argument is really just simply a set of statements, which we call premises, that are intended to support a specific conclusion. And that specific conclusion is also itself a statement. So one of the things that we need to do, first of all, is just identify when something is actually an argument, as opposed to just sort of an outburst of emotion or something like that. So identifying arguments versus non-arguments, and taking arguments that are presented in regular language, like these examples that I had above, and turning them into, as best we can, what we'll call well-crafted arguments. So these are arguments where we do have the specific premises and conclusion lined up just right so that we can do a good job of assessing whether the argument is valid or it's cogent, or whether it's good or whether it's bad. Okay, so arguments versus non-arguments. So a non-argument would just simply be an expression of emotion, or a command, telling us to do something. So these might maybe hint at possible arguments. If somebody has an emotional outburst, then that might be because of specific reasons. They might be emotionally reacting to a specific situation or an injustice or whatever it might be, but they need to say that. They need to list what are the reasons that they're having this emotional outburst, and what do they want us to conclude based on those reasons. And maybe then we'll have the same emotional reaction as them. But just an expression of emotion by itself, that's not an argument. So another way that something that's a little closer to actual arguments are these sorts of things. So a report or an assertion of fact, that is when it's not associated with appropriate reasons to support this assertion. But if it's just a statement by itself, even if it's got some sort of extra stuff like here talking about causal claims, one thing was caused by something else, like this might hint at an argument about understanding sort of the causal sequence of events and some prediction we might make based on our understanding of causation. But just a statement like that this thing caused that thing. This happened because this other thing happened. Like that's not really an argument. And a conditional statement by itself, if this thing happens, then this other thing happens, or if this is true, then that must be true as well. So those are conditional statements, and they could be part of an argument, and they might be hinting at a possible full argument, but just on their own, they don't count as arguments. So here's some examples, right, for reports or assertions. Raptors are carnivorous birds, for example, hawks and eagles. Okay. That could be part of an argument, but by itself, it's just a statement of what raptors are. Or the causal claim, right? I got burned because I touched the hot pan. Like, okay, this could be part of an argument against touching hot pans, but just by itself, just saying that this is what happened and what the causation was, that's not in and of itself an argument. Or this, a conditional statement, if you go out in the rain, then you'll get wet. Again, this might be part of an argument about whether it's a good idea to go out into the rain or not, but by itself, it's not an argument yet. So what we're looking for, some of the things that sort of hint what we've got as an argument, or when we see these kinds of terms. Now, you know, say I burned my fingers because I touched the hot pan, so there's a because, right? So these aren't perfect, you know, these aren't completely reliable hints as to whether you're dealing with an argument or not, but they give you a sense, right? If these sorts of words are included in maybe a paragraph of text, or, you know, a series of sentences, then these are hints that what you're dealing with might indeed be an argument. Okay, so I've said this a little bit already, but a well-crafted argument is one that is easy to follow and understand. And we can assess how good of an argument is this. If it's a deductive argument, is it deductively sound? If it's an inductive argument, is it cogent? And so those kinds of, you know, well-crafted arguments are what we see in textbooks. You know, we had an example in a previous presentation, you know, all humans are mortal, Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's a well-crafted argument, straightforward. We know exactly what the premises are, we know exactly what the conclusion is, and we know we can assess exactly how well those premises support that conclusion. But that's not literature, right? That's not the kind of thing that you would read in an essay or a novel or whatever other kind of literary work that somebody's produced. They're going to dress it up with all these other rhetorical flourishes, perhaps, and then it would be up to us to tease out those specific premises in the conclusion. And so there's a little bit of work involved. Okay. Yeah, so, you know, we're not necessarily, when we do that, when we're converting a block of text into a well-crafted argument, we're not necessarily making it better literature, right? In fact, we might be making it worse in terms of literature, in terms of like, are people going to enjoy reading this or not? But that's not the goal. The goal isn't to make it good literature, it's to make it clear arguments. And in fact, I alluded to this earlier, but very often, you might have some really sort of convincing essay or an opinion piece in a newspaper or something, and you're really moved by it. But what happened in some cases is that the author threw in all these rhetorical devices to make you feel like the author is very reliable and that we should trust what they're saying and we're going to be on board with them. But they did that to mask what turns out to actually be a really bad argument. And so that's one of the reasons why it's so important to be able to get good at picking out what the actual argument is and separating it from all the other rhetorical flourishes. Okay. So when you're presented with some big block of text like we had at the beginning of this, the best strategy usually is to figure out what the final conclusion is. Like, what is it that this author is really trying to finally convince us of? And there's some other, some hints, terms, especially if it's a therefore. That's a pretty good indication that you've got a conclusion. Again, these aren't perfectly reliable. Still, you have to do some intuitive work to figure out if this really is their conclusion and whether it really is their final main primary conclusion that they're trying to convince us of. But nevertheless, these are terms that when you see them, it's like, oop, that might be a conclusion. And so take a closer look. Then the other thing is once you've identified the conclusion, then you look for the specific premises. And so here are some words that can give you a hint as to what the premises might be. What are the supporting statements, the supporting reasons in favor of that conclusion? And again, these aren't perfectly reliable. It's not like every sentence that contains a because is automatically a premise that you need to really be paying attention to, but these are hints. These are things to look out for. You might be finding a premise when you see these words. Okay, so here's just a really, really simple argument. And it's not even that fancy of an argument, but it's something that you might see presented in sort of the public sphere. You might see it out in the real world. We should abolish the death penalty because it does not deter crime. So what is the actual conclusion here? So what do they really want to convince us of? What's the take-home message? Well, they want us to abolish the death penalty. That's the primary goal of this sentence, is to get people on board with that idea. And so what are the supporting reasons? Well, we've got a because here. right? And as we said before, having a because gives us a hint that we're dealing with a supporting premise. And in fact, that's what it does here, right? Why should we abolish the death penalty? Because it does not deter crime. And so if we were to convert that into a well-crafted argument, it would look a little bit more like this, right? With numbers and everything, right? It's just a single premise, so it's a pretty simple argument, but the death penalty does not deter crime. Straightforward statement, and then the statement that's the conclusion, so therefore, we should abolish the death penalty. Okay, so that's obviously like a really easy example, but hopefully, once we get some practice, that we'll be able to do this for even more complicated arguments. Okay. So, well, here's another thing to watch out for. We might need to rephrase what the author has given us in order to make sort of the logical structure of their argument more clear. So this is a really common example. Conditional statements come in a wide variety of forms, but the standard form is if A, then B. Whereas the author might have phrased it a little differently. They said B will happen only if A happens, or B is true only if A is true. But we need to convert that into standard form in order to make the logical structure of the argument more clear. Okay, so what are some of the other things that we need to do here? We need to, as I mentioned before, sort of strip away all these rhetorical devices, this excess verbiage, all the other things that the author throws in there to make it interesting to read or to make the audience sort of feel on board with the author's intent. Psychological or emotional persuasion, certainly that's a common technique, again, especially if the argument itself is kind of weak. It's maybe not that great of an argument, so the author might need to throw in all these sort of emotionally charged terms and phrases in order to get our emotions on board, and maybe we won't notice then that the argument itself is not so great. On the other hand, the author might be writing for people, the audience might be people that are very well aware of what the arguments are on this topic. And so this author might be, they're trying to present their own argument, but along the way they might say, well, there is this other argument that has a different point of view and a different conclusion than mine, and so I want to mention it just so that we can set it aside and continue on with my own argument here. So that happens a lot, right? Acknowledging counter arguments. And as I've said before, it could be just the excess stuff that's included. It could just be because it's fun, right? It's just funner to read, sort of creative writing as opposed to sort of the dry presentation of premises and conclusion, or obfuscation, making it unnecessarily complicated, adding in all these weird sentence structures and so on, in order to mask the fact that maybe this isn't such a great argument. Okay, so here's some other sort of specific techniques that are used. The discount technique. So this is sort of the official label that's given to this acknowledging and then dismissing possible counter arguments. So for example, let's say that in the course of somebody's argument, they have this premise and they say, although sometimes people help others, all humans are selfish. And let's say that that's part of their argument. Well, what are they really saying here? Like, what is the actual statement that the author is providing us with? Well, it's all humans are selfish. That's the core of the message of this sentence. This, although people sometimes help others, well, that's just acknowledging that there might be some reasons for not believing this statement that all humans are selfish. But that's not the core. When it comes time to deciding whether this ultimately is a good argument or not, the statement is all humans are selfish. So that's what we need. That's what we preserve. And we just kind of get rid of this whole although people sometimes help others business. Okay, another one is repetition. This is a really common rhetorical technique where they just restate one of their premises or restate the conclusion. This is a little tricky because they might restate it using different terms, they might rephrase it somehow. And so we have to be sure that the rephrasing is still basically saying the same thing as the original phrasing. So here's just a simple example, right? So the author might say, all humans are selfish. They only care about themselves and will not help other people. So really this can just be boiled down to all humans are selfish, right? They only care about themselves. Well, that's just saying that they're selfish. They don't care about other people. They will not help other people. Like, well, that means they're selfish. So they're really just saying all humans are selfish 3 times here. And so all we needed is once, what's the most straightforward statement of what they're trying to say here? And it's all humans are selfish. Okay, assurance. So this is when the author throws in some terminology to indicate that they have very high confidence, or that the audience, we the readers, should have very high confidence that their statements are true. So they might say something like this, obviously all humans are selfish. And then we'll hopefully not think about that too much, and we'll just accept that premise, accept that statement is true, because gosh, after all, it's obvious and we don't want to feel dumb. And so it's like, we're just going to accept it since apparently it's obvious. Like, well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't obvious. But the author perhaps doesn't want us to do that kind of critical thinking about this premise and wants us to just move on. And so they say just obviously, or everyone knows that this is true. And that business of stating how confident we should be, typically we just strip that away, right? That just doesn't matter. And so again, the real statement here, if this is a premise in an argument, is just this: all humans are selfish. That's what the author is saying here. A hedge is similar, but it's sort of in the opposite direction. It's a way that an author can indicate that maybe the premise isn't true, but let's just accept it for now and continue on. So they might say something like this, oh, well, perhaps all humans are selfish. And then they explore what the results of that might be. What are the consequences if that's true? But the perhaps, that does no real work in their argument. As far as deciding whether the argument is valid or it's cogent or whatnot. The perhaps, or this business of, as far as I can tell, well, that doesn't have any logical meaning to it really at all. It's not what the core argument is really about. It's not one of the premises. You being able to tell something is not one of the premises. The premise is all humans are selfish. So again, we just strip it down to that basic statement. Yeah, so this is we have to be a little careful with this kind of stuff, talking about somebody's confidence or how they feel about something, because it could turn out, some arguments are about the confidence, right? It's about our confidence level and what we should think about that confidence level. So for example, suppose that I'm somebody who bets on sporting events, then I might present this argument. If I know the teams well, then I have confidence in my predictions about who's going to win the game. And then for this particular football game or whatever it is, I might say, I know the teams well, so therefore I do have confidence in my predictions. So although it's using this term about having confidence and so on, it's that's what the argument is about. It's about my confidence. And so stripping that away would be inappropriate here. Similarly, things seeming to you, before he said, it seems to me that all humans are selfish. And I said, well, get rid of that whole "it seems to me" business. It's not doing any work. Well, in this argument, it is doing work. It's actually an important part of the argument, the way things seem to me, because we're talking about my own mental states, my own feeling of happiness. And I'm the best judge of what I'm feeling. So if somebody else is trying to claim that I'm not happy when it seems to me that I am happy, it's well, that's really good reasons, really good counter argument against their claim that I'm not happy. If it seems to me that I'm happy, then I'm happy. And it seems to me that I'm happy, so therefore I am happy. I don't care what you say, right? So stripping out the "it seems to me" here would be very inappropriate, because that's sort of the core of the argument. That's an important supporting part of this argument. Okay, so another thing that we'll want to do when kind of converting regular prose, regular writing into a well-formed or well-crafted argument is try as much as possible to employ uniform language. When we're referring to things, we want to use the same word for that thing over and over and over again. And that can make for boring writing, right? You want to try different vocabulary words so that the reader stays interested in what's being said, and maybe it's more entertaining that way. But that can also make the argument itself more confusing, more difficult to assess how good the argument is. So if somebody at one point in their essay is talking about friendship and then they start talking about camaraderie, okay, those are sort of synonyms, but are they exactly the same thing? Well, maybe that's going to throw us off and it's going to make it a little bit tougher to really zero in on how good their argument is. So here's an example. And this is actually another really famous argument. It comes from William Paley. It's called the argument from design. And it's actually an argument in favor of why we should believe that God exists. So if something appears designed, then it was designed. Living organisms look for all the world like a great work of engineering. Therefore, living creatures were put together based on a plan. Everything that's planned out must have something that came up with the idea, so therefore there must be an architect of life. Okay, maybe you sort of get what Paley's trying to say here. You can kind of get the flavor of his argument, but if you're going to really, in a serious way, assess how good this argument actually is, you need to clean it up. You need to use more consistent terminology for all the things that he's referring to here, because he's not referring to very many things. He's referring to design, a designer, and organisms. And that's pretty much it. So just say that, right? So if something appears designed, then it was designed. Living organisms appear to be designed, therefore living organisms were designed. Everything that's designed must have a designer, so therefore living organisms have a designer. So much more straightforward to assess the quality of this argument. In fact, this might be a deductively valid argument. It's certainly another question whether it's a deductively sound argument. If you take the appropriate kind of class, this will come up and you can have an interesting debate about that. But at least we can see what the actual argument itself is. We see what the logical structure of the argument is, and it makes it a lot easier for us to assess whether it is in fact deductively valid or maybe whether it's inductively cogent. Okay. So here's another extremely important part of certainly debating. If you're debating with somebody and you want to debate in good faith, that is, you don't want to misconstrue what their ideas are. You want to sort of address their actual ideas or their theory or their argument directly, and you don't want to end up having the people involved in the debate just sort of talking past each other and talking about different things, because it just spirals out of control. This is kind of the standard for supposed debates or arguments that happen on social media. People just mischaracterize their opponent's viewpoints and they just throw it around. They seemingly perhaps intentionally misinterpret what each other is trying to say, and it just goes nowhere. So in order to really make any progress in the debate, you need to be fair and charitable to your fellow debater. So, and these are very closely related ideas, being fair and being charitable. So fair, loyal to the original author's intent. So they wrote something and maybe it's not 100% clear exactly what they were saying. They didn't say it, they didn't structure it in a really straightforward way. So then when you convert it into a well-crafted argument, you need to make sure that that original author, if they were to look at that, they would say, oh, yep, that's pretty much what I was trying to say. They would agree with your sort of reinterpretation of their argument. Same thing with being charitable. Again, they might be a little unclear, it's ambiguous or vague, maybe they left something out. And so when you reconstruct their argument in a way that's more clear, so it's a well-crafted argument, then the original author, if they were to look at it, it'd say, yep, that's, so you took out a lot of my creative rhetorical flourishes, but nevertheless, that's my core message. So as long as the original author would agree with what's being presented, then you can go about the business of assessing their argument and coming up perhaps with counter arguments or specific problems with their argument one way or another. And then we have a real debate. We can make actual progress rather than just people flinging accusations around and talking past each other. Okay, so just diving into a little bit more detail on being fair and charitable. So you might not always want to stick with the author's exact wording, especially since sometimes their exact wording may not be a statement. They might be presenting a premise as a rhetorical question. So, who knows, maybe some people are talking about policies in Germany in the 1930s or something like that. And so this issue of the Holocaust comes up, or maybe they're comparing something that's happening today to what the Nazis were doing. And so somebody, as part of their argument, says, yeah, well, so was Hitler compassionate? Like, well, it's a question, right? It's not a statement. But if they're using this as support for some conclusion they're trying to make, and we needed to reinterpret this in a way that makes sense and that can be evaluated for their argument, what we would say from that is Hitler was not compassionate. That seems like the message that they're trying to give us, right? When they just say, was Hitler compassionate? Nobody would say that he was, right? I mean, he's sort of presented as a paradigm example of somebody who's not compassionate, right? This ruthless, killing millions of people. Don't necessarily stick to the author's exact wording, because the exact wording may not be a statement. And similarly, don't stick with just the superficial meaning, even if it does have the form of a statement. For example, they might be using sarcasm, right? So if somebody says, yeah, Hitler was really a compassionate guy, like, well, so do they really think that Hitler was compassionate? Is that really what they were trying to say? You could take that and say, like, aha, I got you. You think Hitler's compassionate, so that means you're a Nazi or whatever. And that's silly. That just doesn't do anybody any good. Maybe it makes you feel good for accusing somebody of something, but it doesn't really make any progress in a real debate. So what that person is actually saying is Hitler was not compassionate. That's the statement that we're supposed to take from this. Okay, being charitable. Very similar to being fair, but sort of interpreting what's being said in such a way that it favors the person who's presented it, right? So there might be a debate over some new law or a policy or something that could involve some censorship. And so somebody that's in favor of this law, they might say this, right? So how important is freedom of expression anyway? Well, there's two different ways to sort of interpret that. What's the statement that this person is trying to make? Are they trying to say freedom of expression has no importance? Like, well, that's sort of silly, right? Why would they think that? There's not good reasons for thinking that somebody would believe that freedom of expression has no importance. So the charitable interpretation of that rhetorical question is that what they were trying to say was freedom of expression has perhaps low importance, or lower importance than maybe this law, the intention of this law that's being passed, something like that. Like it might be an anti-obscenity law or something. And somebody say, well, it's my freedom of expression to present these obscene things. And somebody says, well, hold on, like it's more important that we protect children or somehow don't cause offense to people. And so how important is freedom of expression anyway? Well, what they really mean is freedom of expression has lower importance than sort of protecting people from these obscene things. Okay. So another thing to keep track of here when teasing out kind of the well-formed argument from a block of text is to distinguish their actual conclusion from any sub-conclusions. What is it that the author really wants us to take away from this? What's the real belief they want us to get out of this versus a conclusion that was drawn, but it was really a conclusion that was used to support the final conclusion. And so that argument from design that we had earlier is a good example of that. So let me scroll back up to that. So notice we've got a therefore in premise 3, in line 3 here. So that's a conclusion. Therefore living organisms were designed. That's a conclusion based on the first 2 premises. But it's not really the take-home message that William Paley wants us to get from this argument. He wants us to believe that organisms were designed, sure, but that's not where he stops. If he just stopped there, then that wouldn't achieve his ultimate goal. His ultimate goal was to give us reasons for believing in God. And so he's got to do a little bit more work and show us that everything that's designed, like these organisms, must have a designer. So therefore, the organisms have a designer. And of course, who else could be a designer besides some supernatural being that is capable of designing and building organisms? So that really was Paley's intent. So yeah, just figuring out like even though it's a therefore and it is a conclusion, it's a sub-conclusion that's used to support the final conclusion. Let me find it back down here. Oh yeah. So we did this one. Then, so next up, this is part of being fair and charitable. is including any obvious missing premises. And so this can be pretty tricky because an argument, like the person who's writing the argument, might fail to include an important premise because they think it's just so obvious that that premise is there. It's just strongly implied by what the author has written, but didn't actually explicitly write it in there. So if that's the case, it's a charitable move. It is charitable to the author to go ahead and put in that premise because we need it in order to assess how good their argument is. But it could be that the author just has a bad argument, right? And maybe their argument could be made better by bringing in new premises. But if the author didn't really strongly imply that those premises should be included, then we can't include them, right? Because then we're doing too much work for the author. We're not reinterpreting their argument. We're taking their argument and constructing a new one, a brand new argument that's maybe better than the author's original argument. So we can't put words in their mouth. So it's tricky. It's a fine line there. And I've got an example coming up that maybe will make it a little bit clearer. But by the way, when you do this, you could actually be helping or hurting the argument. It could be that the author left out this very strongly implied premise. The reason that they didn't make that premise explicit was because if you do make it explicit, it'll make it clear that their argument is actually not that great. But if we're going to assess how good their argument is, we need to throw in that missing premise in order to do a fair job of evaluating their argument. On the other hand, it might make their argument stronger. They just left it out and they just assumed we would get it. We would assume that that premise is really there, even though it wasn't explicitly written. But when we do write it in, it makes it clear that perhaps this really is actually a good argument. So let's look at an example here. So let's say that what somebody wrote was, just obviously not all mammals are land animals. Think of whales, dolphins, and seals. So that's not really an argument exactly right there, right? Certainly not a well-crafted argument. It seems like there's an argument in there, but we need to sort of modify it in a fair and charitable way in order to have sort of an argument that we can actually assess. And so we start with, with this: whales, dolphins, and seals are mammals. It's like, okay, that seems to be what's implied here, is that they are mammals. And it's also implied that those mammals, whales, dolphins, and seals, are not land mammals. That seems pretty clear that that's what they're trying to say here. And then their conclusion is what's actually stated: not all mammals are land animals. Or another way of phrasing that is, some mammals are not land animals. And so this is a fair and charitable reinterpretation of this sort of argument that we have in the quotation here. And once we sort of spell it out in this way, it's like, oh, this is actually a really good argument. In fact, it might be deductively valid, might be deductively sound. And maybe it wasn't completely clear when we just had their original quotation that this is actually a really strong argument. Here's an example the other direction. So Bob is a basketball player, so he must be over 6 feet tall. Like, okay, that's an argument. It's not a well-crafted argument quite yet. But so what's implied here? So being a basketball player means that you're tall, or that you're over 6 feet tall. So what's the missing premise to connect Bob as a basketball player to the conclusion that he must be over 6 feet tall? Well, it seems like this, right? All basketball players are over 6 feet tall. In order for this to be a reliable conclusion, seems like we need that premise. And it seems like he's implying this premise in the quotation here. But when we make that premise clear, we realize, oh, this is an invalid argument. Well, I'm sorry, actually, this is a valid argument, but it's not deductively sound because it's deductively unsound. Yeah, so because that second premise is false. It's just most basketball players are over 6 feet tall, especially professional basketball players. But it's certainly not true that all basketball players, not even all professional basketball players, are over 6 feet. Okay, so this is sort of this beginning steps in what it takes to take a block of text that's just regular writing, and start to convert it into an actual well-crafted argument that strips away sort of all the irrelevant stuff and just figures out what are the exact statements that act as premises and what's the exact statement that acts as a conclusion, put them in the right order and line them up right, add in what's implied, and then evaluate how good this argument is. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop there.